Okay, welcome everybody. If you'd like to submit questions at any time during the session, feel free to click on the Q&A icon and just type your question in the box below and select host from the drop-down menu, and we'll answer those at the end of the session. We will be recording and sending you an email within a few days. And with that, I'll pass the ball to Sandra.
Thank you very much. Is that working?
Yes. Yep.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Alex, for having me back. I'm excited to share a little bit about my experience with LaunchPad. And so I'll begin by talking just a little about myself. My name is Sandra Gilliland, and I'm a assistant professor of psychology at Louisiana State University at Alexandria, which is in the center of Louisiana, if you're not familiar with that. I've been teaching psychology, introduction to psychology, for about 10 years now, and I find it incredibly rewarding each and every semester that I teach it. I feel very blessed to do something I love and to teach a subject that I'm passionate about. I always say that teaching was my great surprise of my career. When I went to my undergraduate studies, I knew I wanted to go into psychology, and specifically I wanted to go into counseling. And so I declared my major as psychology when I arrived at Northern Arizona University, and I was one of the very few students who did not change their major. I continued with my major, graduated, went on to get my master's degree in marriage and family counseling, and then began pursuing licensing and became a licensed marriage and family therapist. And then one semester I was asked kind of randomly by one of the guys at the local university if I would teach an introduction to psychology class. I thought, well, that could be interesting, and so I agreed to do it. And a few weeks into the class, I'll never forget this experience that I had when I was teaching, where we were talking about different things, talking about learning, and I mentioned, have any of you ever heard, or I asked the question, have any of you ever heard of little Albert, who of course is in the picture here. And I was surprised of a class of about 35 students, not a single student raised their hand. And it was just kind of an exciting moment for me when I realized I was the professor who got to introduce these students to the field of psychology for the very first time. And for some reason, that moment really stood out to me, that I had heard about little Albert for many, many years at that point and had heard him referenced in different ways. But I was the first one to tell these students this crazy little unethical study that was done with this child to teach him how to fear different objects. So it was an exciting time, and right there in class, we pulled up the original videos and we talked about it. We talked about ethical concerns, and the students wanted to know what happened to him when he was an adult. And it just led into this really beautiful discussion that the students were engaged in and I was engaged in, and from that day on, I knew the classroom was where I wanted to be. And so I went back a few years later to get my PhD in psychology and counseling, and I just love it. I just really feel very fortunate to be there. With teaching psychology, and specifically teaching introduction to psychology, though, there are some challenges with teaching this class. Specifically, the introduction to psychology class has a tremendous amount of content. I'm not sure how other universities do, but I know at our university we're covering anywhere from 10 to 13 chapters, depending on how the textbook is laid out. Maybe not every part of every chapter, but there is a significant amount of content to try to cover in 16 weeks, which is the next problem. We just don't have enough time. And so whether my class meets twice a week or 3 times a week, each lecture we're covering multiple topics that could easily take the entire lecture. And so that can be frustrating and overwhelming at times when I want to sit and camp out on one of these interesting anecdotes and I just don't feel like I have the time in the classroom. And of course, the last issue is one that I sometimes feel I have very little control over, that students just aren't prepared. They come into class and they've not read their textbooks or they've not done the assignments. And so I feel like we're starting behind every class, as I feel like I'm having to try to get students caught up to where we were so that we can move forward and that they can really understand the material. So with these challenges, we have to begin thinking, what are the solutions? What are some ways that we can deal with each of these? Of course, we could try to teach less, but the nature of the introduction course is they have to have the foundation for all of their future psychology classes. And I know at my university we have specific objectives that are required, so that makes that a difficult solution. I do know that some colleges have opted to offer 2 semesters of introduction to psychology, which frankly for me sounds like a dream come true. My university has not talked about it. I think it would be difficult because it's a gen ed class for us, and I think it is for many universities. Trying to get 2 semesters worth of that gen ed, I'm afraid students would take one, and if they weren't required, they wouldn't take the other. So that is also problematic at many places, including my university. The last option I have then is to try to increase my students' accountability, to try to put some of that responsibility back on these young adults so that they are more prepared and that we can get through a more meaningful amount of content. And this is the reason I have just fallen in love with LaunchPad, and I find it to be an incredible tool that I can use to help me get back to enjoying teaching instead of feeling overwhelmed trying to get through all that content. So some of the benefits I have found since I've started incorporating LaunchPad, which I did about 2.5 years ago, first of all, I think it does promote positive study habits for my students. Rather than them listening or partially listening during lectures and then trying to cram all of that information in before the first exam, they're being required to turn in these practice tests and watch these videos or whatever the assignments in LaunchPad are, that they're going through the material in a little bit at a time throughout that course of that 4 or 5 weeks, however long it is, until that first test. So it promotes that positive study atmosphere. The second one is that I know that some students just need a different pace, and so using LaunchPad allows some students to work ahead. I've noticed many of my student athletes will work on their LaunchPad activities and get ahead in the class if they're going to be traveling or going to tournaments. And other students, they can go a little bit slower so they can digest that information at a pace that may be more comfortable for them. I tend to talk fairly rapidly, and some students love that, and some students I know it can be a struggle for them. And this, again, kind of puts it back in their court as far as the pace which they want to go. The third benefit that I have found is that it really encourages students to see and experience the content in multiple ways. So rather than just hearing it in the lecture or just reading it in their textbooks, they're reading it in the text, they're hearing it in class, and then they're engaged with the material through these different activities on LaunchPad, whether it's the practice tests or the learning curves or one of the other activities they might be doing. So again, it gives them multiple exposures to those key concepts that I'd like for them to gain. Some of my personal outcomes that I have found, this is just a very simple demonstration of one of the measures that I used to kind of see if LaunchPad was working for my students. What you're looking at here is just some information, some percentiles. I broke it into percentiles because the classes were a little bit of a different size. On the top in blue were the final exam scores for my students in the spring 2014 semester when I was not using LaunchPad with this class. And so you can see with that we've got about 11%, about 15% had A's on the final exam, about 22% had B's, and so forth. And really we had about 16% that still received an F on that final exam. Below that, in the spring of 2015, this is also just looking at not the overall grade, but just the final exam score. And you can see a shift in the data. One of the things you'll notice is that I still had about 15, in this case 16%, who got A's, so not a statistically significant difference, really about the same number of B's, but where we see the huge shift is in the number of C's and the number of F's. And this is what I was really excited about, that you can see that the number of F's that the students received on the final exam went from right about 17, 16% all the way down to about 6%. And you can see where they obviously shifted. Even the D's went down statistically very significant numbers, and they all shifted over to the C categories. What this tells me is that students who are determined to get A's and B's, for the most part, are still getting A's and B's. But those students who were struggling to pass the exam, they were struggling to pass the exam because of all of that content that we were asking them to cover, 3 and 4 chapters, and some comprehensive areas on the final. They just weren't able to do that. They were struggling with that. And this seems to have pushed them back into the C range on that final exam. So to me, that was a great outcome. The other outcome I can say is that my stress is down, and I think student stress is down as well. As I mentioned before, I enjoy in the class engaging with the students, relaxing a little bit, pulling up extra videos, watching commercials that are relevant, or pulling up an article that's relevant in their current day. And this program, using LaunchPad, really does allow me to do that. It allows me to just slow down, chase some rabbits, because I know that the students are still going to see the additional content through the LaunchPad program. So I may only cover 2 or 3 points that day, and I'm going to tell them you're going to cover the rest of this on LaunchPad. And because they have that accountability, I feel very confident in throwing that ball back to the student and allowing them to do that. The other area, I think students really get stressed out whenever their entire grade is based on just 4 assignments, 4 tests. And I know that would stress me out as well. And so this allows students who maybe struggle on exams, they can do the work, put the time in, and do very well on their LaunchPad grade. I always tell them, this is your cushion. This is where you can get some points, you can earn some points, and it'll offset a lower exam score if you struggle on the test. The last thing I really appreciate from my standpoint is sometimes I think the semester is going to go super smooth, and it does not. If we have snow days or if I'm sick, a couple of semesters ago I ended up having to have an emergency gallbladder surgery, and I missed about 3 or 4 classes. And because I had the LaunchPad program, we had to adjust the semester schedule, but it really wasn't as bad as it would have been because the students were still going through the content. They still had something to fall back on, and we were able to continue moving forward. So I appreciate that. I think it just takes some of the pressure off of me, and it puts that responsibility back onto the student for some of their own learning. Just to give you an example of how my syllabus has changed, this is pulled right out of my syllabus just to show you kind of how the point distribution shifted once I started using LaunchPad. This is an example of my on-ground traditional 16-week course. If you have any questions about what this looks like for my online classes, I do also use LaunchPad in my 100% online classes as well, which is a little bit different in the way that I do that. But what you can see here is before I started using LaunchPad, the total points possible in the class were about 600. 4 exams, a couple of homework assignments, which consist of small papers that they write, and then participation points. And that was just really my motivation to try to get students in class and engaged and give them some points to help offset the weight of those exam scores. After I started to incorporate LaunchPad, I made several changes. For one thing, the exam scores, I wanted the percent for the exams to stay relatively similar. So even though the points possible went up to 810, I shifted to having our tests be worth 150 points each as opposed to 100 points each. Because they were getting LaunchPad, I was also able to condense to 3 exams as opposed to 4, which again saved me some additional class time. And then I took away 2 of the homework assignments. I made the 2 longer papers as opposed to 4 smaller papers and made those worth a little bit more points as well. And then, of course, you can see they've got their LaunchPad grades. That's the entire semester points added up. We've got 260 points there. So the key for me with LaunchPad is maintaining that academic independence of trying to find something that worked for me. And so let me just show you what my calendar looks like. This is my current semester calendar. And you can kind of see I prefer that the students are going through their LaunchPad activities while I'm lecturing on the material, so that we're kind of tracking one another. You can see at the beginning of the semester I'll be teaching Chapter 1, and they are reading Chapter 1, and they're turning in their learning curve for Chapter 1 all within that same couple of days. As I move on to Chapter 2 in the classroom, my expectation is they're reading Chapter 2, and now they're turning in the learning curves for Chapter 2 as well. So some professors prefer that the students finish their learning curves prior to the lecture starting. I kind of like them to be in the material while I'm in the material, but you could really do it, again, whatever works for you as a professor. This is the preference that I have. I also use the summative quizzes. So as the learning curves are testing them on little bits of information as they read, their reading comprehension, making sure they're getting the key terms, the summative quizzes, I tell the students, are really like practice quizzes. And you can see I have all summative quizzes, so in this case we're covering Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, and the first half of Chapter 6. In that case, all 4 of the summative quizzes are due the day before the exam, which is today. I hope that they're doing those quizzes today, in fact. So with that, that just helps them prepare for the exam, which will be tomorrow. And you can see I break that down into Unit 1, 2, and then I cut it off here at the bottom, but Unit 3 at the bottom for our final exam. This is what my current LaunchPad screen looks like. I have it broken down into 3 units. You can see that it parallels my syllabus and my class schedule so that hopefully students aren't confused. It looks the same. It uses the same verbiage, Unit 1, 2, and 3. And, of course, it has the due dates on there. One of the things I like about LaunchPad is it comes preloaded with a lot of information. You can add additional videos, additional concepts and actions or activities that you like, but you don't have to use all of them. You get to pick which ones are for points and which ones are just there as supplementary material. So for my on-ground classes, again, I do it a little different from my online classes, but my on-ground traditional courses, I do have the learning curves for most of the chapters that we cover. I appreciate that LaunchPad breaks it up into, for example, here in Chapter 4, you can see there's a 4A, 4B, and 4C. So for each of those smaller pieces, the students are going through and testing their recall and their recognition. And then at the bottom of this, it would say the summative quiz for Chapter 4 as well. So I like to leave the additional materials. You can see that they're not worth any points. But if a student comes to my office or they're struggling on a concept, one of the things I may refer them back to is to say, well, have you looked on LaunchPad to see if there's some additional helps or additional ways that you could see that material that might help these concepts be more clear. So I don't usually take them out, even though they're not worth points, the students want to do them, and sometimes they just want to watch the videos, they enjoy them, and they can do that as well. One of the other things I've started doing, which I do think helps, is I use a lot of examples from LaunchPad in class. So this is a video that if you teach psychology, you're probably familiar with, the split brain research. I usually show this video in class anyways, and I purposely in class will log on to our LaunchPad class as a class, go there, and show them, hey, this is one of those extra videos that I left. We're going to watch it today and do the assessment together. And this allows them to see that I use the program, I like the program, it brings it into the classroom. So rather than it being kind of this disconnect that I introduced it on the first day and then I never talk about it again, we refer back to it fairly frequently in the class. I'll ask the students, was there anything you saw or liked or any problems you're having? And so it continues to be an additive into our class discussion. Overall, I have found that since I started using LaunchPad, in general, the grades are up and my stress is down. So for me, it's been a win, and I'm really excited about it. I think my students have done well. The majority of students have said that they really like the program, that it works well for them, and that's really all I have to share today, but I'd love to answer any specific questions. I've got some stuff pulled up that if you guys want to see, I can certainly do that and show you what my class looks like in more detail. But that's the end of my presentation.
Great, thank you. To what do you attribute the shift in grades after using LaunchPad?
So referring back to kind of that slide where I showed my test grades, I think the biggest difference was students were being forced to digest the information as we went, as opposed to waiting until the night before, which I think is the tendency of most students, certainly the students that I work with. And so by, encouraging them to, excuse me, I switched out of that screen, by going through the material. And the summative quizzes are very similar. They're multiple choice questions, so they're really doing those practice quizzes the night before. I think it really helps them know kind of how those questions are going to look and be phrased. I think that's probably the biggest difference.
Okay, thank you. How difficult was it for you and your students to learn?
I found, my first semester was kind of an interesting semester. I came to LSUA. I was at Rogers State University in Oklahoma, and when I came, I took over for one of our other professors who had moved to an administrative role. And when I got here, she had already signed up to do a pilot with LaunchPad, but she was currently using a different program for her other introduction to psychology, which I was given both sections of. So it was an interesting semester where I was teaching two back-to-back sections of introduction to psychology, but one I was using this other program from a different publisher, and then the other I was using LaunchPad. And I had used the other program before, but LaunchPad was brand new for me. So I will say that it was a nice semester, but it was also a crazy semester because I had to remember which class students were in and which program they were using. And I found that my students consistently had less problems with LaunchPad. And really for me, that was one of the main reasons I went to it. I can, most of the time, I'd say 9 times out of 10, go onto LaunchPad, kind of know what I want to do, and intuitively I can figure it out. I find it to be very user-friendly. I don't get a lot of questions from my students, which tells me they get it, it works for them. I do the first day spend a little bit of time showing them how to navigate it, telling them the tricks that I've found out, showing them where to look to check their progress and their grades. And once I do that, I find that most of my students do extremely well. So after the first semester, I felt pretty comfortable, and I really have not had many students tell me that they weren't able to feel comfortable in the program.
Great, thank you. Well, that's it for questions. If you wanted to run through sort of the other content you had pulled up, if that would...
Sure, I was just going to show kind of some of my favorites that I use for my online class, if any of the professors happen to teach online. Let me bring it over here. I had it pulled up and then I closed it. Let me see here. Well, I say that. Let's see. So in the online class, the biggest difference is I do use a lot more of the video options and things like that, just because the students aren't getting the time of lecture in class. So this is my current online class, as you can see. And this is actually a 7-week online class, which is a whole different discussion. But with that, I did go ahead and create a student profile for myself, just so you can look at kind of what that looks like from that perspective as well. This little box was in my way. So of course, right now as a student, I'm not doing very well at all because I only did a couple of the assignments. One of the things I really appreciate about LaunchPad is this is what it breaks it up into each week. Of course, when I create the grade book, I choose to put the categories into weeks so students can see how they're doing week to week. And with that, I can look at a number of things. I can look at the overall grade book, which I'm looking at now. I can look at the activity log. This is great if a student tells me, hey, I spent last Wednesday trying to do this and I was having problems. This allows me to look at what day they logged on. I just created this yesterday just for today's presentation, so it only shows yesterday's work on here. But it'll show the entire semester's worth of material every time they've logged on, what they were doing, and the amount of time they spent on it. So that's really helpful for me as an instructor. I can also see how much it's worth. Of course, the students can see in red that these are the assignments that they missed. So again, I did very poorly the first 4 weeks of this class. And then, of course, you can see the couple of activities that I did do. I went through the learning curve, and I can look at overall class statistics as well as my score, how they answered on each activity. And I also, in my online classes, of course, I do take advantage of the discussion forums. I have found that the grading the discussion forums and LaunchPad is extremely easy. We use Moodle as a university for our online platform, and I find discussions very difficult to grade in Moodle. And so what I love about the LaunchPad discussions is that when I click on each little link here to grade it, it'll pull up for me everything that this particular student has responded. So in this case, I just added one little discussion thing here. We're talking about personality surveys. And so I added my results here. And so it shows me that I participated one time. I only spent 1 minute. I was copying and pasting this from an external website, so I didn't spend much time. It shows me how many words. And then if I was looking for replies, it also tells me the number of replies. But if I had replied in here, those replies would show up in the red text as well. So very quickly, I can see everything that this particular student contributed to the discussion. But it will also show me in blue what everybody else participated as well. And so I can see who they were responding to and kind of how that discussion was taking place. And then I can quickly give them a grade here out of 30 points, and I can also add notes. If they missed points for some particular reason, I can tell them why they missed those points. And I've got some other options here as well. So for my online class, I do still have the exams. The major exams take place in Moodle, and I have some note cards in Moodle, and I've got some PowerPoints in Moodle that students can access. But the vast majority of their class is actually going to take place in LaunchPad for my online students.
Great. Thank you very much. Unless there are any other questions, great. Thank you very much, Sandra. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And you should receive an email in the next few days.
All right. Thank you.